Hello, everyone. Welcome to English Sponge. Today, James and I are recording a podcast episode for you all. And the topic for today is the series Downton Abbey. It is a very popular British TV series, and it actually has had some spin off movies. There is the final movie coming out this month in movie theaters, and so we thought it would be a good time to discuss the show. I've been a fan of the show for many years. I think I started watching it when I was in college, and so throughout the years, I've been following the many seasons and have not watched the movies, but I plan to watch them soon so that I can go to the theaters and see the ending of the story. But in the meantime, I wanted to get James's opinion about some of the aspects of the show, and see what he thinks as someone who lives in the UK. Uh, Downton Abbey is a period drama, meaning that it depicts a time period in the past, and this is a really popular genre of movies, of television, and it depicts England in the early 1900s. And so it depicts some of the history of his country, and I would love to have a conversation about what he thinks about the show.
Yeah, of course, I'm ready. As a Brit, I'll be the Brit in this discussion. I will admit that, like, this kind of show is not exactly my cup of tea, right? But I know it's a really popular show from the UK, so yeah, I'm sure I have some things to say about it. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So just to begin, to give you an idea of how popular this show is. It's been very popular in both the UK and the US, and internationally as well. But I would say the main viewership is from both of our countries. And so, to give you an idea, at its peak in season 4, it drew in 13.3 million viewers, and the total estimated global audience is 120 million people, which is like the size of some countries. What do you think about that?
that is genuinely quite shocking, I would say. Did you say 100 and what did you say? 130 million? Is that right?
120 million.
120 million. Yeah, I mean that is insane. And I imagine
Yeah.
most of those people are in the UK and the US, or maybe there are people from all over the world watching it as well. I
Yeah.
don't. I wonder how popular it is, like around the world. I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't dig into those statistics, but I can imagine that um, any country that has had some sort of history with Great Britain or the UK, that has left behind the English language, probably has some viewership, probably has some strong viewership. Um, and of course, in the US, it's very popular, and I'll get into more of why I think so later, and get your opinion as well. But something interesting that I found out when I was researching this was, um, Downton Abbey was broadcasted on PBS, which is the public broadcasting service in the US. It's like public television, and they play a lot of international content for us. Um, they've been on the air for 45 years, and Downton Abbey is the top drama of all time on PBS for the past 45 years.
I mean, yeah, that's crazy. You would think that the top drama on that network would be, like an American show, right? It's based in America. But yeah, it's surprising that a British show is the best show or the top show in America. That we can definitely talk later about why it's so popular in the US.
Exactly. Exactly. And the last thing I'll say on this is that um, Downton Abbey had the most Emmy nominations of any international series uh, in history, in U.S. history, or in the history of the Emmys, which is an award show for television programs. So it's had an impressive run, and I can understand why after the show's end they wanted to continue making spin-off movies, because audiences were not done with the story. They still wanted more, right? It probably reached its peak popularity as the show was coming to a close. So you can really see how attached people are to the characters, and that actually brings me to introducing you to some of the main characters of the show. So we have in this image here a picture of the entire household. And so the building in the background is Downton Abbey. It's a castle. And like I said, this show is set in the early 1900s. It actually starts in 1912. And so this is an image from the very first season, and it shows the entire household. And so the household includes not just the family, but also the servants who live and work in the household. Um, do you see nowadays many families that have a lot of servants living at home with the family that they serve?
At least not in the kind of social circles that I hang out in. No,
Definitely.
I've never seen anybody who has a servant before. You know, I don't. I suspect that nobody does really. I mean, obviously people have cleaners and things like that, but yeah, I think servants are a thing of the past, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they use the word servant in the show quite liberally. Uh, Nobody really bats an eye at the use of the word servant, um, meaning that nobody finds it strange that they're referred to as servants. They even have a servants' hall where they eat their meals and things like that. So, let me introduce to you some of the main characters. So, right in the middle here, standing in the front, is Robert Crawley. He is the Lord of Grantham. And I believe these titles are fictional for the television show, but he is an earl, and so he is referred to as Lord Grantham or Lord Crawley, which is his family name. And right to his right is his wife, Lady Cora, and she's actually an American. So she is not English. They married each other because this is something that predates the events of the show, but they married each other because she was a very wealthy woman from the United States, and there was sort of a arranged marriage, and it was kind of a way for an American to enter into nobility, which is quite interesting. But uh, anyway, so they have three daughters over here, all the way on the right. And a lot of the show really revolves around this first daughter, Mary, Lady Mary Crawley, and her life, her challenges, her especially her attempts to find an appropriate match for marriage, an appropriate suitor, because she wants to essentially, one of the main conflicts in the show is that Lord Grantham doesn't have any sons. He only has daughters, and both him and his wife sort of feel bad that their oldest daughter, Mary, isn't going to be able to inherit his title and Downton Abbey. And so there are many attempts to find her a suitable spouse who might be able to give her some status that would be equal or similar to what she could be if she had been an oldest son, right? So you see the gender issue is very prominent in this show. And the other daughters also have a lot of different things going on in their life that is depicted in the show. They're also trying to get married and find purpose. And then there are these characters on the left that represent the working class characters of the show. And one of the reasons this show is so entertaining, I think, is because it shows what we call upstairs, downstairs dynamics, as in the upper class family lives upstairs in the castle itself, in the abbey, and the servants live downstairs. The kitchens are downstairs, you know, the laundry rooms, a lot of the work that they do happens behind the scenes downstairs, but they have their own lives and their own drama and relationships as well. And so there's kind of for the viewer a chance to see both lifestyles in this show. So you have the butler and the ladies' maids and the cooks and the footmen, and they're all part of this elaborate household that has a lot of staff to do things like serve all of the meals and attend guests, and very specific roles in some cases to serve one particular family member, and things like that.
You know, it's good to see
So
that.
that's
Sorry to
yeah.
interrupt
Go
you.
ahead.
It's good to see because I actually have not really watched this show. Like I said, it's not really my cup of tea, you know. But it's good to see that they do actually give attention in the show to the working class people as well, and not only the upper class people. Because actually, I had the impression that this show was just all about upper class, rich, wealthy people. But it sounds to me like they also give some attention to the lives of, like you said, the cleaners, the butler, the servants, and so on. So that's good.
Absolutely. A lot of the drama in the show is is equal. There's a lot of attention to the working class and a lot of attention to the family, the upper class family, the Crawleys. And so what I think is fair criticism of the show, though, now that you mentioned that you thought it was primarily about the noble family, is that they are definitely presented as lovable characters. Over the course of watching the show, you begin to care about their troubles and care about their romantic plot lines and story arcs, and how they change throughout the show. You know, the two sisters have a rivalry, and you start to care about silly things like the dramatic thing that happened at dinner, and some of the things that are going on in their life are definitely very petty and silly, but because they are part of the aristocracy, they have big repercussions. They have big consequences. So things that happen in this house have a ripple effect on what happens in the British aristocracy as a whole, and their reputation and their marriage prospects and all of these things that they have to be concerned about. That being said, the relationship with the parents and the daughters is very interesting because every time that there is some sort of issue that could be seen as scandalous for an upper class woman to be doing, ultimately they're always very gentle and very accepting and loving of their daughters. It makes them out to be very lovable characters, even though they might care about some silly things. They come across as even progressive at times. The show tackles issues like, I don't know, having a relationship before marriage, or marrying someone who is not also upper class, or having a job, driving a car, wearing something that's a modern style, right? No matter what their daughters do, even if there's conflict, they all love each other unconditionally. And I think that makes for good television, but in reality, and maybe you can tell me a little bit more about how realistic that is, because my impression of nobility is that marriage and having children is not just for the sake of love. My question for you is, do you think that that's a realistic depiction of an aristocratic family?
It's difficult to say. If I were a historian, right? If I were a historian, I could tell you very accurately. But I would say that probably in that time period, I would guess that for two people to get married, if I were to guess, I would say the main reason that would happen is for, to maintain their wealth, and to maintain their status. And basically, they would want to marry somebody wealthy to keep the money and the wealth in the family and so on. I would imagine in reality, probably like actual romance was probably not necessarily a big factor in why people got married. Although it's difficult to say, I'm sure every aristocratic family was different. I'm sure some of them did marry for romance and so on. So yeah, I would say probably mostly not, if I were to guess.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you really see the daughters especially struggling against that idea that they will have to marry for status and for wealth. They still want love. They still want romantic love. And so there are many suitors along the way, and some people live, some people die, some relationships come to an end, and sometimes romance rekindles, and there's all of these emotions the show takes you through. But to have a happy audience, they really want to give these characters a happy ending, right? A love story that we can admire. So it's definitely a bit of a fantasy. You can really feel uh, that it's very fictional in those moments, but you still come to adore, the relationships that they have with different characters.
So it's not
So
necessarily, I was just going to say, it's not necessarily like completely unrealistic that, like, I'm sure many of these wealthy aristocratic families, I'm sure many of them were nice and kind and good people generally, right? But of course, they were living in a system whereby it was normal to have servants and normal to really think of some people being better than others just from the family they were born in. They may be nice people, on a day-to-day basis, but
right.
maybe it's just the world that they live in.
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely get that impression. Lord Grantham is very kind to his servants. He cares about their well-being. He wants them to celebrate holidays and deal with when they have their own personal issues. They apologize. Of course, they are very deferential to the family, but they have a sense of, I have my own family and I have my own personal affairs, and I'm entitled to look after them. And the family respects that, and there's friendship as well between some of the servants and some of the family members. They kind of see them as a part of their family, as a part of their household, I should say. And so that's also a nice thing that I think the audience really likes to see, is the friendship between certain members of the upstairs and the downstairs, and how they interact with each other over time. There's also servants who don't really have a lot of respect for the family, and they see it as a job. They see it as a way to make money primarily. It's a good job to work for a noble family, and they have some resentment, definitely, about why do they get to live this way while I'm here, stuck serving them at dinner, and they do things that they sometimes regret, or um, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of hijinks and uh, stakes involved for everybody. I want to get into a little bit the difference between the upstairs and the downstairs. It's very stark in this show. It's very clear from the first episode. And I think, especially watching as an American, it's fascinating because, of course, we have class differences here in the United States, of course, but there's a sense of social place. Like there's a place where you fit, a place where you belong, and your identity is wrapped up in that. Do you feel that in British society that that's still a factor?
That's a really tough question, actually. In a way, yes and no. I guess my answer is yes and no, because obviously the answer is no, because these days there really aren't clear barriers as to why somebody who is really poor couldn't actually become rich. I mean, at the end of the day, anybody could start a business, right? There's no reason that you couldn't do that, especially with the internet nowadays, right? And that business could be successful, and then that poor person then becomes a millionaire. And there's no actual barriers to doing that. People would, of course, argue about that. But generally speaking, no. However, definitely there is old money around. Yes, like the people who are incredibly wealthy, the people who have been in families that have been wealthy for generations and generations and generations, they obviously they exist still, and they have these big houses and these a huge amount of land, like a giant garden and so on. So these people do exist, these people who have generational wealth. So it's a tricky question to answer. I would say, to be honest, I would say mostly no. Although, having said that, well, it's a difficult question. I would say mostly no these days. I mean, there are politicians and, successful people really from all over nowadays. Having said that, at the same time, a lot of our prime ministers and so on have gone to the same colleges and the same universities, and they're like in the same group of friends. A lot of them go to Eton College, and then a lot of them go to Cambridge or Oxford, and they sort of all know each other and so on. So it's a really tricky question. I would say mostly no, though.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a big part of the fascination of the show, and part of why it's so popular is it depicts a time that is not that long ago when these differences were very important. But you do see that every character is rubbing up against the changes that are happening. There are so many rapid changes happening in the 20th century, right? And the show takes you through some of those events, like World War One, and how that changed the dynamic of labor, and with many men dying in the war, and some returning back, and how to handle that, and what role do noble families play, in the war effort, and things like that. But anyway, I think that's part of the fascination for both American audiences and British audiences, is that that it's a part of your history, and it's interesting to see a depiction of that, right? We don't have nobility, right? We don't have nobility formally in the United States. We might have some de facto nobility, but it's really through enterprise. It's through business. It's new money, as you mentioned before. It's the whole idea behind the American dream is that you don't have these social constraints like you did in the old world, where you had to stay in your station, or it was very rare to escape your station. The whole idea of America and the American dream is that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as in you prepare yourself to work very hard, and you, on your own merits, you can rise. You can rise to fabulous wealth, right, and success. And because of the influence you can gain from that wealth, you can kind of serve as de facto nobility in the sense that you have influence over politics and people care to respect you and things like that. But it's not assigned at birth, right? Although of course even people who earn their wealth will try to make sure that that wealth stays within their family and things like that. But we don't have things like heirs. That's a big part of the fascination for American audiences.
Of course, like movies like the Titanic, for example, like the whole point of that movie was that it was people moving away from the class system, the rigid class system in the UK, and moving to a new life, right, in America. And that's why people were so desperate to get on the Titanic, because they were moving away from the class system in the UK, where if you're a poor person, you really had zero chance of ever becoming rich. Moving to America, which is supposedly a place where you can go and create any life that you like without the rigid class systems. And that's what the Titanic was about, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And funny that you mentioned that. The way that this show opens in the very first episode is a telegram informing the family that the Titanic just sank, and Lord Grantham's heir was on that ship, and he died. So it starts off very dramatic. So he loses his male heir, which was like his nephew, because he only has daughters, right? And so that starts this crisis of like who is going to be the next heir. He's like a third cousin or something, and he's going to come in and displace the eldest daughter. That doesn't seem fair, you know. They don't even know each other. So, and there's always these attempts for the oldest daughter to marry whoever the heir is, whether that was her cousin who died on the Titanic or this new guy coming into the picture. Another thing from the very first episode is that the difference in accents between the working class folks and the upper class folks was very stark from the very beginning, and it makes you realize that those differences may have been reinforced socially over long periods of time, that people of different social status actually speak differently. And you see right away, if you're ever watching an interview of these actors talking about their performance, they don't speak this way normally. So it's a form of acting as well, to take on this accent to play a posh character. So you definitely see. I don't know if the characters playing some of the servant characters are also doing something similar, but clearly they have a familiarity with the different accents in the UK to be able to kind of try to create some historical accuracy for the show.
Yeah, I would say most British people have a pretty good familiarity with all the accents. Like a lot of us we will recognize where somebody is from based on their accent. And even to this day, sometimes you can even make a judgment about somebody's social class, or maybe if they're wealthy or not, based on the accent. Now that sounds weird, but it is true that if you do hear somebody talking in this way, you might well assume that they're probably rather wealthy, you know. Like you would not expect somebody with that accent to be poor. Mate, I'm going to the pub. I'm off to the pub now. See you later. Like you may not expect that person to be wealthy. it's an old stereotype, but it does still kind of persist today, I would say, a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, that's super interesting to hear that persists, and that the average person might have some stereotypical ideas about that person just from hearing them speak. I mean, I suppose that's the case in all languages, but um, it's I think for Americans, it's interesting because the UK seems relatively small compared to the size of the United States. And so I think we're kind of fascinated by the fact that there can be so many different accents in such close proximity, such close uh, quarters, you could say. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about that?
Only that it's true that it is quite crazy the number of accents that actually exist, like you said, in such a small country, in a relatively small landmass. There's a lot of different accents. I mean, there's a different accent for the city of Liverpool and a different accent for the city of Manchester. But you can take a train between Manchester and Liverpool, and within like 50 minutes or so, you can travel between the two. So they're not even particularly far apart in terms of distance, but they have two completely different accents. And yeah, I would say this is quite a unique thing for the UK, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, that just brings me to my last point is I was going to ask you, why do you think that this show has been so popular for both British audiences and American audiences? I mean, I can think of a few things, right, that we've discussed. There's differences, the cultural differences that are fascinating for Americans. We don't, like I said, we don't have aristocracy, so there's also that sort of curiosity and this prestige, right, that we don't have access to. And so there's like glamour. The aesthetics are beautiful. They wear beautiful clothes. They live in beautiful buildings, and the stories of love and sabotage, like the the episode with the food and the soup. It's entertaining and it shows regular human emotions and things like that. But is there anything that stood out to you just from watching the clips, about why you think the show has been so successful?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult for me to say because, like I said many times at the beginning, it's not really that the kind of show that I personally would usually watch. But if I were to hazard a guess, right, if I were to hazard a guess as to why this show is so popular in the UK, it would be because perhaps a lot of people, they like the idea of living in a time like that, right? Like living back then may seem to many people like quite romantic, back when there were a lot of traditions and formalities and things like that. Perhaps for many people it seems quite romantic for them, compared to now where we kind of have the modern world. In the UK, we're a lot less traditional. There are a lot less, let's say, boundaries. People can do what they want. People dress however they want now, right? And perhaps a lot of people sort of like the idea of having to dress well every day and having to wear certain things and having a certain reputation and so on. This is something that is kind of missing.
Mm-hmm. So romantic, and it sounds like nostalgic for a previous time.
Nostalgia for a previous time, although to be honest, if you really think about it, if you did live in the time of Downton Abbey, chances are you probably would have been one of the servants who were working at the house. The number of people
Right.
who were actually, the aristocracy is a very small percentage of British people. If you lived back then,
Right.
you probably would have been lucky to be a servant there. More likely you probably would have
Exactly.
been living in poverty, as a chimney sweeper or some hard job in a mine somewhere, something like that.
Right. Exactly, exactly. Which is why, shows like this that have a lot of focus on rich characters can give can give you sort of a false sense of you start to relate to characters with a lot of wealth, and you would not in real life be able to relate to them, very very likely not be able to.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, and you probably, although of course everybody does relate to the rich characters. I don't imagine most people when they're watching Downton Abbey imagine themselves as one of the servant girls or imagine themselves as
Right.
the cleaner or something. I imagine most people are probably imagining that they would be, the duke or the earl or and so on.
I think, despite some of the criticisms that you can make about the show, whether it's realistic, whether it's romantic, romanticizing things, whether it's historically accurate or not, it's a show that has brought me a lot of entertainment and joy over the years. My last question for you is: do you think Downton Abbey, for those of our viewers who are looking for some advanced content, do you think that Downton Abbey might be a good option for comprehensible input?
Yeah, I suppose it really would be advanced content because it's not exactly the way that people speak usually in the real world. But yeah, sure, it would be good if you're very confident at English already, if you can already understand, regular shows of regular people speaking regular English, then definitely sure, Downtown Abbey would be good for an advanced student. And I do notice that some of the upper class people do use some different grammar structures, which would be really nice to listen to. Things like, were I to have known that you were coming, that kind of structure, it's good to acquire different kinds of grammar structures as well. So, yeah, a good option for somebody who has a high level of English, I would say.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I think for me, as a native speaker of a different dialect of English, right? Just listening to the show for so long has given me an ability to. I'm sure you get this all the time, like people who try to show you their British accent. I'm not going to do that, but maybe another time. Maybe another time. But just from listening, I think it gives you the ability to mimic for sure, right? Because you see the movements of the mouth and where they emphasize and where they don't, and so it gives you the ability to mimic whatever you listen to for a long period of time. So, like you said, maybe it's not the most accurate for how people speak today, but you will be able to do a really good British accent if you're anything like me. So,
And that's an important skill to have. But it's interesting to see that even as an American, you yourself are almost using it as comprehensible input in a way. You are kind of absorbing the pronunciation. Your brain is noticing the mannerisms of the characters and the way they talk, and it has helped you to imitate British people. And of course, that is true for students as well, using
absolutely.
comprehensible input.
Do you have any final thoughts?
I don't think so. I think I've basically said everything about this show. Maybe only that maybe I will go and watch this show, or at least attempt to watch this show. Now that we've been talking about it for so long, maybe I will finally go and watch it for myself.
Yeah, let me know if you do. We can continue discussing it for sure. Yeah, I'm glad I could introduce it to you. I think it's a timely topic because the movie is going to be coming out soon and the story will finally come to an end. So we might both be encountering people who have a lot to say about Downton Abbey in the coming weeks. So yeah, I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I know I took Sam's spot this week, so I would love to be on more. And
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope that you learned a few new words today, a few new pieces of vocabulary. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next podcast.
I was going to mix in some syrup of figs, but I've not done it yet.
Well, at least we'd have all been regular.